Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. Of course, I really appreciate everybody being here, given these uncertain times, and hope that everyone's able to get through this period relatively unscathed. And looking forward to getting back to work again. My name is Brandon Cusick. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Axiom Regenerative Therapies. We co-founded this initiative with our orthopedic and pain partners at our ASCs in order to really push regenerative medicine forward. So this presentation we'll be giving today is really part of a series where we're walking through elements of running a successful regenerative medicine practice in the MSK space. My responsibilities are over all the Axiom Network partners. My graduate work and research was done at Harvard University and Children's Hospital of Boston, where we did quite a few studies and publications for pediatrics. I've done global work in medical missions and been quite a few places that's allowed me to study and look at population level data and allows us to really deep dive into making a sort of gradual effect on a community, and something that allows us to really look at broad sets of data and understand what the implications might be from a clinical and as well as an epidemiological level for those populations. I am based out of Kansas City with two young boys and both a competitive tennis player and a recipient of regenerative medicine myself, as well as family members and friends. So I'm really quite a believer in where regenerative medicine fits into the algorithm of treating pain and dealing with some of the things that we'd like to see regenerative medicine address in the future. So, like I said before, this fits into our overall network discussion when we talk about building a regenerative medicine practice. So what we're going to talk about today is on patient outcome registries and how those fit in, and that's really fits in our 6 points that we have listed here, fits into the staying compliant and up to date. A patient registry is critically important when working with different parties, the FDA, physician scientists, and a variety of different constituents who are interested in data that's coming out of regenerative medicine. Because when we look at the landscape today, we see quite a few things. Inconsistency in treatment delivery. This is where we're seeing different practitioners practicing in different ways. There's really no set, you'll go to one meeting and receive some way that you're going to have a procedure performed. Things as simple as PRP can be done 4, 5, 10, umpteen different ways. So the treatment delivery types are really inconsistent. Patient types, as we start to look at patients, the number one question we get from clinicians is, how do I open the conversation with patients? I know how to diagnose them, but where does regenerative medicine fit into their treatment algorithm? So helping to define what those patient types look like. In a cash pay industry, there's zero regulation of costs, so having an understanding of where that cost is, and then insurers are particularly interested in this as they look to cover something like this in the future. Clinical protocols are often driven by good data. So when we look at the industry today, in a lot of cases, there are no set clinical protocols to follow. There may be some pre and post instructions for a lot of patients, but when we look at inclusion and exclusion criteria, much of that is defined in small publications or by the physician themselves, just through experience or just having gone through training. Really, when we look across the landscape, the national landscape and international landscape, there hasn't been a formal incentive to share data. And that point is somewhat driven from the fact that if you're in an academic institution, certainly you have access to resources, as I've had in the past, that allow you, if you have an interest or a study that you want to perform, it's quite easy to get that process started, having the right team around you to be able to do that. But in private practices, which is most of who we work with today, that ability, that incentive, or that ability to share data doesn't really exist today. So really having something that allows you to look at data across the nation where you compare is important for clinicians who really want to see regenerative medicine succeed not only in their practice, but succeed in the industry as well. And then, of course, when we look at serious adverse events, that's going to be an element that we talk about. But at this juncture, when we look at regenerative medicine stem cell use, you're going to hear highlights about when they're improperly used, because it happens, rarely relative to the broad application of regenerative medicine today. So, and then as we talk about throughout our series every Wednesday, we know that the practice of medicine is now the business of medicine. And an aspect of that is certainly making sure you're compliant and up to date with everything that you're doing. So let's go into this. And what we're going to be talking about today is a patient outcome registry as it relates to regenerative medicine in the MSK space. I'll be giving some examples throughout this presentation of how we utilize data and how we've set up workflows and how we work with physicians to be able to drive data sets and provide the analytics on the back end to our partners. But really, when you look at a patient outcome registry, what you're looking at is a comprehensive set of data. That data itself allows for tracking results of how patients are doing. And when we look at results, they're often tied back to what was the diagnoses, how was the treatment performed. There's several elements that are important, and then looking at the 1 week, 3 month, 6 month, 12-month outcomes that patients are receiving relative to their expectations. As data scientists, those that are interested in using the platform to conduct epidemiological and translational research, this becomes critically important as we look at this industry going from 20 years ago being a very nascent industry to where it is today, somewhat being a wild west, but certainly very much a part of the healthcare landscape. And then where it goes in the future, where we start to look at, and that future is very close. We're just a couple of years away from this, where we start seeing it as a part of the pain algorithm, just as HA or corticosteroids or total joint replacements are in the pain algorithm for a patient. And then when we look at this, we certainly, from a broad perspective, want to look at and measure the incidence rates and measure that relative risk for the relationship between outcome and exposure to certain treatments. So that registry itself, again, going back to the fundamentals, we're really which says data set. And that data set, it's sort of the garbage in, garbage out philosophy. And what you want to have is certain elements that are set up so that if it's patient driven for the most part, we want the best data to come in, because that allows for the best data to come back to the physician, or the best analysis to come back to the physician or the constituents who this may be relevant for. So speaking of that, let's talk about who this registry is relevant for. Most of you who are on today either have a regenerative practice or are interested in regenerative medicine, perhaps dabbling or going about it pretty extensively as it stands. But all the physicians want to know at a fundamental level how their patients are doing. If they're going to administer treatments that are either experimental or something that is not the traditional mode of treatment, they want to see that the patients are having good outcomes. And if they're having bad outcomes, they want to know what the risks were going into it and be able to understand that so they can moderate any sort of adverse events. Data scientists exist to help study that risk and efficacy of treatments. So certainly large data sets. There's today, as it stands, there's really no comprehensive national registry that compares this data. This sort of holy grail of this is really when you compare both the patient outcomes and with some of the biologic data. So things that are done with the CFUF analysis, cell counters, some of these fundamental things that allow us to look at the biologic that's actually going into the patient's body and then tying that to some of the outcomes that they're getting. So scientists are really very interested in that, and there's a lot of incentives for people to be collecting and sharing that de-identified data sets to better understand how we can go about treating patients clinically and appropriately. So the other constituents would be biologics and medical device manufacturers. Those that are in the space have done their own sets of analyses, perhaps even published publications, white papers, worked with clinicians. But we know that large medical device companies are looking at this because they start to see that biologics are becoming a very serious player in respects to competition for their medical devices. So when you look at somebody who's very traditionally doing major joint surgery and these medical device companies supporting them, what they want to do is they're keeping an eye on biologics to say, is this an industry that's pushing forward? Are physicians doing more of those cases than they are relative to these medical device procedures requiring medical devices. So they're keeping an eye on this as an industry, certainly, and then working in conjunction with the clinicians that they work with. The FDA is a huge party, and we'll talk about the FDA a little bit. They have some abilities to help you out during this process, but certainly the FDA wants to see good data. If you're running a clinical study, they want to see the best possible data, and they have various amounts of requirements, whether you have an IND or a PMA. But just in general, even if you are running a practice and you're doing experimental procedures or you're engaged in regenerative medicine, showcasing that you have been collecting data is certainly a good baseline for the FDA to go off of to say that you're remaining compliant in what they're looking for. And then as we get into the insurance side, we know that there's going to be a transition. So right now, with most of these procedures being cash paid today, we look at the self-insured employer networks, and that includes workers' comp groups. Typically, these are regional or small plays, but it allows employers to have this covered underneath of their plans and have regenerative medicine be a part of that. And then as we extend beyond that, we really look at the commercial insurance plans, and these are the Blues and the Cignas and the Aetnas out there are looking to cover these procedures. We know it's favorable, but they need good data in order to do this. So looking at the types of patient outcome registries, you really have two broad categories. There's a couple others, but I wanted to keep us focused here on these two. You have private and commercial-based registries, which is what we have at Axiom and for our Axiom partners. This is typically run by a third party like ourselves. We require BAA between the clinic and the third party. There's HIPAA compliance in the app, and these can be web or text-based, meaning the patient outreach can be done via a HIPAA-compliant platform and messaging service. And typically these are overseen by an IRB. So depending on the registry that you're looking at, IRB coverage is really one of the sort of gateway or entry points if you're running a registry. And IRBs are in an academic setting, but then there's also private IRBs that you can work with that will oversee that the data is being collected correctly, that's being de-identified, and that you're actually keeping patient safety in mind. That's number one, and the safety of that data is being covered. Now, the FDA itself does have a program called FDA My Studies, launched in 2018. Like anybody on the private side, it's compliant with 21 CFR Part 11 and the Federal Information Security Management Act. So that allows, the FDA saw that people wanted to get into the data collection side of things. So they gave we'll call it a rough template for an individual to be able to go out and sort of customize his own version of an app and set it up themselves. Now, it does require some technical knowledge. It doesn't necessarily require coding, but depending on your level of understanding or having run a study before, you would have to go through some sort of setup process to be able to do it. But then once being able to do that, the app is configurable for different therapeutic areas, which is favorable. So looking at this, you have the private and commercial-based registries, which are set up and designed, and someone you can partner with. Ours is called Axiom Pro, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But then there is open source code via the FDA themselves. So that may be the technical aspect, but let's talk about the key questions for the regenerative medicine industry. We believe there's about 3 fundamental questions when we look at a registry that allow us to really understand, is this having the desired effect and meeting the expectations of patients without putting them in harm's way. So those 3 questions, when we look at the change in pain and disability levels over time, that's where we look at this as a longitudinal study. And so sometimes this is a check-in 24 hours after a procedure, after establishing baseline, looking at it a week after, looking at it 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and even up to 2 years in some cases. We are focused on MSK and osteoarthritis, primarily because that's driven by the FDA guidelines right now in the regenerative medicine industry, where they have, at least for the last 3 years, really given somewhat of a a lower priority on the enforcement side for the treatment of MSK and osteoarthritis. And there's a lot of great publications coming out in this space. And I think at the basic level, just collecting that change in pain and disability scores is critically important in understanding a patient's genuine outcomes. And then when you look at patient level characteristics and can these predict treatment outcomes, I think this is something, these next two questions are the ones where we really want to take the data and be able to provide some sort of predictive algorithm to understand what kind of outcome a patient is going to have, allowing a clinician and the team and those that are involved to really help set the expectations so that when patients come in, you can start classifying those patient types and really look at what can I tell my patient? What kind of outcomes can they expect? And the reason a registry is important for that is at the clinical level, it's up to the clinician to be the one determining that and the one to be able to say that to the patients. If you work with a patient care coordinator, which we've done a presentation on in the past, those people have broad level data, but as it relates to the specific clinician, often cases, it's going to come down to the clinician and his team getting that good data to understand, hey, we use PRP in this case because X, Y, and Z. We recommend a bone marrow treatment. Here's some of the outcomes for those patients, given that you're in the similar profile of diagnostic criteria. And then finally, when we look at regenerative medicine treatment characteristics, the dosage, the inflammatory profile, can these also predict treatment outcomes? So these questions really drive the fact that having good data, having a registry to collect that data set up for analysis is something that's going to allow us to move this forward where we can start getting into that predictive treatment algorithm. That's going to be important not only for individual clinicians, but really moving this industry from everybody doing whatever they want, different treatment algorithms, different clinical pathways, into really standardizing this and making it clearer in the patient's mind, because frankly, we know patients are becoming a consumer of their own healthcare and they're going out and they're trying to research as much as possible. So this starts to consolidate some of that information for them. So within this, really, what do we want to look at? And what I'm going to do is break down some of the elements that would be considered in a registry, as well as some of the tools to track patient outcomes that includes questionnaires and such. So whether you're building your own registry, like we talked about with an FDA tool, or you're utilizing a partner, some of the things that are really important are to look at the commonalities or look at the things that would be essential in something like this. So we talk about these pieces here, and I'll kind of break these down. So when we informed consent is important. You know this for the treatment side of things, but the registry typically also requires informed consent because you'll be collecting patient data. Typically, these can be just a simple document. In a lot of cases, the tools for using this, and we'll break that down here in a little bit, either can be on paper, but if it's electronically managed, the patient can review it and sign it, and then that can be shifted into their EMR or your EMR for the most part. So the informed consent is critical. It's sort of the baseline for patients to have their data collected, and there are some good resources out there for building that informed consent. We have a library of these for each of the different procedure types, and then as well as an informed consent for the registry. Patient eligibility, so outlining that inclusion and exclusion criteria. Really, the exclusion criteria is the focus point here. Exclusion criteria would help to stratify a patient's risk going into certain procedure types. I think when we look at the news, or you look at anytime the FDA sent a warning letter, in a lot of cases, our team, when we see these, we look at those, we go, those patients probably shouldn't have had a treatment of this type in the first place because they were in that high risk category. And so when we look at exclusion criteria, the reason you're seeing this in MSK and osteoarthritis is because you're getting a lot of pretty standardized messaging, and the patients are relatively the same diagnostically, and so you're kind of seeing variations in the pain level that they're coming in with. But as long as there's no other coinciding complications, that should allow you to pretty much check off the exclusion criteria and know that you're going to be able to proceed. We talk about control and experimental patient types. This one is, we consider it essential, but in some cases, this may be optional, and depending on if you're wanting to run a study or if you're looking at other patient types, having a control population, somebody who's not going to go with regenerative medicine and may choose the traditional pathway or go to surgery or seek out PT. Collecting that data is also critically important, just to be able to compare against somebody who went with one of the regenerative medicine treatment types. We talk about therapy education materials. These are either marketing brochures or educational materials that allow the patient to understand what they're getting into as far as the treatment is concerned. In a lot of cases, those will include pre and post treatment instructions if they've narrowed down the procedure type that they're going to be pursuing. So that just in general allows for a patient to just understand and set that expectation for themselves. The data capture tool we'll go into a little bit later, but we're seeing a lean towards, in order to future-proof the data collection and make it easier for back-end analysis, we're seeing a push towards electronic data capture. And so we'll get into that, but this allows for a patient to submit their information via a mobile device or their desktop, somewhere where they're comfortable, as opposed to doing all of this in the waiting room, because I think we know collectively that there's so much paperwork already in healthcare that they're doing when they show up for their procedure or if they're coming in for a consult, that the ability for the patient to do this at home is critically important. So we'll get into some of those pieces as well. Adverse event reporting is, again, essential if something were to go wrong. Of course, they're going to call your office, but you want to have this documented as it relates to a procedure, particularly if you're in the midst of a study of any type, and adverse event reporting is going to be required and something that's going to be audited by the IRB. So the final piece is, what patient outcome questionnaires do we really need in order to sort of collect the most robust data set possible? So I'm going to outline some of the tools in this. We'll go over it from a high level, but you'll recognize a lot of these primarily because they come out of publications and they're coming out of the literature as tools that are used collectively underneath, particularly as it relates to the joint-specific questionnaires. But really, we want to be able to collect pain score. We want to collect quality of life. In some cases, a socio-demographic information is important, but the joint-specific questionnaires are really what it boils down to. So when we look at these, I've got two quick slides on this. On the pain score, you had the visual analog scale. This is the please rate your pain from 1 to 10. So the numeric side, you can do that. There's smiley face to sad face kind of thing, but this allows the patient to understand, to at least give some sort of baseline of where they are today. And this is something to be measured at fairly consistent intervals, meaning collecting at baseline, collecting 48 hours afterwards, 1 week, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. The pain score at a minimum is the easiest piece of data to collect, and it's really fundamental to understanding how they're transitioning after their procedure. Quality of life, we use the short form. There's a 12 question, there's a 36 question. We find the short form is generally just as powerful as the 36 these days. It's also less paperwork for the patient. And so when we go into like the joint-specific questionnaires, we have knee-specific questionnaires. Many of you are familiar with the WOMAC, the KOOS, the Tegner. I mean, these are ones that we know that are in the literature and used to collect data on the knee. So we get asked primarily for the knee-specific and the hip-specific, because that's where a lot of these joints are being, or a lot of these treatments are being performed on those larger joints. And then when we move into the shoulder, hand, and wrist, foot and ankle, and back-specific questionnaires, that's where we want to look at the other ones that are available out there as well. So generally, this includes the DASH, the OSS, UCLA has a scoring system, and then in the foot and ankle, the Orthopedic Foot and Ankle Society has put forward theirs as well. Back and neck are also important to include. A good data tool will basically be able to look at this, and the patient will have their joint that they're being treated, and then the treatment type that they're going to be treated with. And that will allow the algorithm to push the right questionnaires to them at the right time. And this helps us when we go forward and we start to look at, when you start to analyze the data on the back end and you want to sort of break out these patient types, at least you have consistency across the questionnaires that you've been asking. So when we look at the industry shift towards electronic data capture, I myself have done several studies where we've rolled out the large packet of paper, printed out 50, 60 pages of paper, and they're going through the pencil and filling these things out. And it can be quite burdensome on a patient and also on the clinic to have that, and then somebody has to data input it on the back end, somebody who would be inside the clinic or a partner that they're working with. But an electronic data capture tool allows for a couple things that will future-proof the outcomes registry. You have the ability to tailor different treatment and patient types, meaning, like we said before, if a patient comes in with EMR integration, you can actually have, if the treatment type is entered in, you can have data being pushed and pulled from the EMR to the specific tool. That allows for it to more easily be able to set up the right protocols and the right questionnaires to push out. But even without that, if the clinic itself can really just set the joint that it's being that the treatment's being performed on, whether it's unilateral, bilateral, and then what the treatment type is, and even some mixture of treatment types, because some clinicians will like to perform sort of a mixture of different treatment types in some cases, but just being able to accommodate for those things and tailor those different types is an advantage of an electronic tool, whereas you'd have to print out the specific joint questionnaires and everything each time for a patient, which can be a burden. On the back end, of course, because this data is inputted, it allows for the data scientist or yourself to be able to pull that data more easily. And it'll typically be in raw format with the questions being answered a particular way. And then that will allow for the team on the back end to actually analyze that data and be able to push the relevant results back to the physician over a period of time. The modern interface is important because we know that patients, I think one of the things we're competing for as we're not only looking at data or looking to collect data, but as we're looking to get these, get them the understanding and the education that they need to go forward with these things, you want to be able to meet the patient where they are. So having an app or having a desktop or a web version that feels like what they would have with any other sort of questionnaire or any other sort of app that they interface with is important, just to be able to get patient stickiness. And we talk about this internally quite a bit because the patient stickiness is critically important, because you want the patients to fill out all the forms that you have and be able to walk through it quite easily without any disruption. And so having that is important. And then finally, I've already mentioned the integration with the clinician's EMR. Even if you're not integrated, there are ways to go about it. And that's something we can talk about. That's usually on a case-by-case basis. But these days, the EMRs have the ability through what's called an API to configure the electronic tools with it. So with all this, what does this really look like? And when we look at, say, running a study or what that patient flow or workflow may look like, what will that be? And I'll show you, what I want to show you is how we use this within Axiom and how we use it with some of our physician partners. So this is a little small, but it's, this is like any workflow. It can be pretty significant as far as the length. So I isolated the portion that was the data collection. So when we look at this across the top row, you've got the visits 1 through 7, and this would be a patient, following that patient for about 2 years using a care navigation platform. On the left side, you have the types of assessments that are being collected. So you have safety assessments, patient outcomes, physician assessments, any EMR data that comes across, and then biological analysis in some cases. Now, we're focusing this presentation on patient outcomes, but the biological analysis is certainly the next level particularly if you're studying a particular therapy or device, you will need some sort of biological analysis to go along with this. So when we look at visit 1, you certainly want the eligibility assessment. You may do a biomechanical function. There's tools and software out there that allows a patient to assess, where they are as far as joint rotation, ability, forces applied on that particular joint. But then you also need to collect baseline intake forms, health-related quality of life, joint-specific quality of life. Any EMR data to support this, any prior surgeries, any prior treatments, any prior medications are helpful in that, but not necessarily necessary. And then that's all collected pretty much prior to or at the procedure. So by visit 2, we're talking procedure day in the clinic. Visit 3, this is where you always have access to a patient-reported adverse event form that can be filled out by the patient, but typically we see it being filled out by the clinic. Again, you want to have that health-related quality of life and joint-specific quality of life questionnaire being pushed out, same one to measure it back against baseline. And then looking at on the physician side, again, the physician adverse event form, as well as a second assessment of biomechanical function. And then 3 months afterwards, patient-reported adverse event form and quality of life. So each of these, when you look at this, the importance here is you're basically measuring each of the same across a period of time. So we, in this case, have done screening, procedure day or leading up to procedure day, 6 weeks follow-up, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months. These all flow to a database, and then if you've got a study protocol that's covered by an IRB, that's where this data will inform the study protocol for how we translate that data into results and how it is conveyed back to the clinician, as well as for any sort of broader study that's being done. So this is just one example. There's a lot of ways to slice this, but again, going back to an electronic management protocol, this allows you to take that data that's being collected, and instead of just being on spreadsheets and all over the place, what it allows it to be is there's consistency across the collection methodology, and there's an aggregation in a place where it can be quickly and easily analyzed so that you can get the results you need. And I think that's what's important for any clinician wanting to understand their outcomes and where these go. So at the clinic level, this is how we look at it. But when we look at the future of how regenerative medicine research is going to change and how we move this into a more traditional mode of or modality of orthopedics, pain management, sports medicine, this is where we look at a couple things. So there's a few research areas that we've identified that we like to focus on, and they sort of flow from one to the next. So when you look at biomarker discovery, we like to see screening and stratification of these biological targets. So beyond the patient outcomes do fit into this because you want to know that based on certain characteristics of the biologic itself, it's having its tailored effect on the patient outcomes. Now, in these cases, you'll need access to the tissue samples for research purposes, but this data, if you have an electronic tool, this data can very easily tie back to that tool so that you can tie to that particular data set that you're looking at. Establishing diagnostics after biomarker discovery, that allows you to then look for that biomarker. So, and we'll give an example of how we've applied this as an organization to a product that we have called alpha-2 macroglobulin, short form known as A2M. And so developing that diagnostic tool detects that biomarker in a joint, and then the ability to match the therapy treatment protocol to the isolation of that biomarker increases the probability for the use of that regen therapy for that indication. So this is where we start to drive from, hey, we've identified the diagnostic criteria, we see the biomarker is present, and here's the level at which it's present, or the severity, and then here's the treatment protocol that would tie to that. So this is, of course, when we look at the future, this is the down the line as we begin to collect this data. And then you can go further on to look at the genome and genomics analysis that allow you to then look at the entire patient or patient themselves holistically and see where this treatment algorithm fits in their treatment profile going forward. Treatment delivery. So when we talk about regenerative therapeutics, we want to improve upon the delivery mechanism and the surgical techniques. So more and more we're seeing regenerative medicine being used in conjunction with surgery. So that's also another data slice to really take a look at when you look at controls versus controls being those who just got the surgery and perhaps those who got the surgery plus the biologic. That allows for the development of how the treatment's performed and the innovation around, what kind of guidance is best for actually performing the treatment. And then you can standardize that over time. And then further down the line, developing protocols and devices that allow for these biologics to enter the market and do it by reducing the risk to the patients and increasing safety overall for both the patient and clinicians. So what does this look like? This was something we did with a product called A2M, something that we carry, and A2M is typically a treatment type for degenerative osteoarthritis. So we see a huge population of potential candidates that fall into this category where A2M would be effective. But really, when we look at how a physician would want to be able to apply the treatment, it follows the same sort of development process. So in the biomarker discovery, Dr. Scuderi analyzed the synovial fluid of patients displaying OA. Therefore, he identified the biologic target, which was A2M, that degrades what's called the fibronectin aggregating complex that's in most of our knees. And then this can be purified from the whole blood of the patient. So beyond looking at that, the development of a diagnostic tool or an biomarker identification tool was developed called the FACT test. It was detected through the use of ELISA, and this antibody detection allows for the patient and the physician to have some sort of numerical or objective data point to relay back to that patient, saying, on a scale of, we use a 1 to 5 to keep it easier. Here's where you are as far as, is this going to continue? Is the OA going to continue its progression throughout the joint? And if A2M is introduced at this juncture, it will help relieve that, or it will help decrease the presence of that particular molecule. And then the treatment delivery was looking at A2M being isolated and delivered intra-articularly in the synovial space. Clinical studies at this point begin to be developed around this, and then positive clinical outcomes where the application of A2M in that joint were lasting up to 6 months. So you really started to see some of the good outcomes that were coming from this. And then further down the line, the device, the centrifuge, and then the further filter was developed to properly isolate A2M so that it could be pulled from the blood and then administered as a point of care treatment inside of clinics. So this is, when we look at good data is really what informed this. And of course, during this process, patient outcomes are being developed or are being collected during this period of time as well. And so that really allows for the physician to then, once they have the A2M product in hand, they know that, okay, I'm going to collect the data on my patients, but I know that these studies have been done before, and having a diagnostic tool or a biomarker identification tool allows me to feel more confident as I'm helping to diagnose this patient and prescribe a treatment protocol. So we see the importance of data and how it fits into the whole equation. As an individual clinician, you have options as far as doing this on your own. There are tools, there's open source code to develop your own sort of registry. But one of the things we encourage is finding a trusted partner in doing this. And at Axiom, we do that with physicians across the nation in our Axiom Physician Network. We of course have our Axiom Pro app for data collection. This has both a physician-facing element and a patient-facing element. We tie this to patient care coordination because we find that patient care coordinators working with the clinician can be able to call on patients, or if patients don't fill out their forms or if they've missed something, the ability to call on them and remind them or just send a message and just say, hey, if you can remember to fill out this portion, that'll help your physician understand the outcomes and better treat you going forward. Because we're really looking at the long-term relationship between the physician and the clinic, and we want to make sure that's there and solid. The Knowledge Center is where the data is housed, and then we also provide the print and digital marketing that supports the clinician's patient volume, as well as providing patient and physician education materials. Breaking out that Knowledge Center, has a huge digital library with hundreds of literature articles on each of the therapy types, typically broken up by joint or by the therapy type. There's a lot of small studies that are continually pushed out, and so we keep this updated fairly regularly. And then we have our team of scientists who are available to our network partners to speak with them if they want to run a study, or if they have questions about a product or questions about a protocol, to work with them on those aspects. One-page summaries that allow for educational materials for the patients as well as providers. And then the data collection is critical for the practice to see patient outcomes. So that really ties back to, of course, our data collection efforts at the physician level. So when we look at the platform itself, this is something where at the end, if you're interested in seeing the platform or a walkthrough of how it's done in person, we can certainly set that up. But it allows for EMR integration and patient follow-up. You don't necessarily have to have EMR integration. It does operate standalone, but it does all the longitudinal patient health tracking that you would want. And then it does store in the Axiom Registry, which the physician can then access and get their data. And then also the comparative data to a national data set becomes something that a lot of clinicians are very interested in. Within the app as well, there's a communication tool for clinics. Telehealth is a part of that. I know we're living in an era now where telehealth has become somewhat of the primary method of consultation for a lot of physicians, or follow-up for clinicians today in an environment where patients can't or aren't willing to come into the practice quite yet. But it also has messaging and HIPAA compliant, both email and text messaging involved inside of it. Patient information can be pushed through that. Research dissemination can also be pushed through that. And then, of course, the electronic management of care protocols. So as protocols do get developed or enhanced over time, you start to see that these get updated within the app almost automatically. And so those updates get pushed, so you know you're constantly getting the most up-to-date version of that particular protocol, or the pre and post instructions, or the consent forms, everything that needs to be done and covered. And then, of course, there's the ability to report adverse events. So this is part of our network solution that we offer to clinicians. Again, we see people and speak with physicians across the country who have opted to go their own route, to do regenerative medicine somewhat their own way, aggregate their own products, put together their own care protocols and such. But we do offer this as a program, and so we just, for a flat fee, we do help clinicians for all aspects, basically a turnkey regenerative medicine program. So this allows us to work with a clinician to provide not only the data collection tool, but the scientists to help back it up, and the research team. So it's somewhat like having those academic resources you had during residency or your fellowship, having that at your fingertips, which allows you to then have not only good data collection, but then the analysis on the back end, so that you can understand your patient outcomes going forward. But our biggest goal is really to reduce the burden of regenerative medicine on the clinical practice staff. We know you have a traditional way of running your practice, and you know, in order to stay ahead of things, regenerative medicine should be a part of it, but how do you go about doing it? That's what we help guide through. Some of that is helping to convert new and existing patients to cash pay. There's a lot of education that goes into that, and we work with our clinicians very closely to do that. And it's something whereas the network continues to grow throughout the country, this is where we start to see good data and good clinical practice really push the industry forward, and we'll know that ultimately down the line we can be able to define those clinical protocols, be able to develop those treatment algorithms, and ultimately treat patients how they want to be treated and meet them where they are. So I think that's it. At this point, I'm going to hand it back to Rachel, but really to find out more about our network member options, or if you'd like a preview of the data collection app or some of the questionnaires, or if you have any questions, I invite you to reach out. Just shoot us an email at info@axiomtherapies.com. Myself and our team are available to speak with you about what kind of options are out there. But we really, I just want to thank you all for being on this call. I know this was a high-level overview of something that is a very near and dear to my heart, and something that we could probably go on and on about. But I'll open the floor up right now to questions, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. We do have a couple questions. The first one is an IRB required to collect data?
So that's a great question. The IRB, when you think about an IRB, it's there for really looking at patient safety and making sure that things are being done correctly. Yes, it is, particularly if you're running a study tied to that registry. So if you're doing any sort of analysis or breakdown of that patient type, registries can also be as simple as just collecting pain scores and some of these simple elements, and that you wouldn't need an IRB necessarily for. But the two things, if you're working with a third party like ourselves, we would have a BAA in place, and then we do have an IRB covering our registry. Great question.
The next question is, I'm not sure if my EMR integrates with outside tools. Can I still collect data if it doesn't?
Yeah, so actually that's a good one. We alluded to some of this earlier in the presentation, talking about EMR integration. Depending on the EMR, there are ways to go about sort of manually doing integration. I know we work with clinicians across the country who are using smaller EMRs that work for the practice, allow for scheduling, keeping the patient data safe and on their servers. But the tool, typically electronic management tools, can be operated independently. It does require a little bit more legwork as far as setting up the protocol within it. So that would be identifying the joint type, identifying the treatment type, and then those should push the questionnaires out. And then you'd have to download the information and then put that into the patient's EMR. So it is a little bit more legwork without integration, but we find that more and more these days, EMRs like Athena Health have really nice what's called APIs, which allow for the plug and play of approved tools to be able to push the data back and forth. But no, you don't need an EMR or a EMR integration to make the tool work on your behalf. And then the other way is, of course, you can just do this by paper. Everything that we have within the tool, we can make available via PDFs as well. Good question.
The next question is, can the Axiom app be used for other data collection?
So yeah, that's another one where we've run into situations where the clinician themselves has a lot of paperwork, or they're collecting data already. They're doing little pieces here and there. We have the ability to customize and tailor. You don't want to stretch too far away from that, because again, like we talked about in an earlier slide, you want to have comparative data. So if you're collecting baseline data and then you're collecting it weeks and months after that at specific intervals, you want to make sure that if you have other data sets that are important to you, or other collection tools that you'd like to use, that you're also doing those in the same intervals, so that the data is consistent, and so that if you're looking at this in a particular way over time, what you just really want to be able to make sure that you haven't overly customized it to the point where none of the data makes sense across all the different patient types, and that doesn't help lead you to develop good protocols to address future patients. So yes, it does. Axiom Pro in particular can customize. We've integrated some of the intake forms and some of the questionnaires that physicians have had, and usually that's just that's something we consult with on a one-to-one basis with our physicians who join us, because it's data that might be very important to them or their team.
When you're using a third-party app like that, who owns the data? The practice?
So yeah, so the practice owns their own data. That's correct. The registry itself will keep the de-identified data, meaning it will just pull the portions. There's no tie back to the actual patient themselves, but the practice themselves will keep their data. And in the registry, again, it's a national. In most cases, it's a national registry. And so, depending on the registry that you work with, it's the case where if you're collecting the data, the physician will be able to keep their data and own their data, and then the de-identified portion will go and into the registry, and that whole collective de-identified set will become a part of the registry.
What type of practice is best suited for Axiom?
That's a great question. So we typically, again, we're working in the MSK space. So we look to partner with orthopedic, pain management, sports medicine partners, and who are performing MSK procedures using, at a basic level, really using imaging guidance and proper diagnostics criteria. So we'll come in and help with the inclusion-exclusion criteria formed from literature, the scientific team, the data collection. But most of the time, we've seen physicians who have gone this road of trying to develop all these pieces individually. So they've gotten, they've tried to build their own data collection app. So they've outsourced that, or they've built it internally. They've put a patient care coordinator inside of their practice, hired that person for, put them on salary, but they just didn't have enough patients to work with, or they didn't market correctly. Some physicians are concerned about their reputation for regenerative medicine in the community. We work with them on reputation management, particularly online, because more and more consumers are going online. And then on the marketing aspect, if there's a lot of regulation around how you market these procedure types, both on your website and in print material and inside the clinic. And so those are the folks that we work with. So those who have gone through this and tried to build their own program individually, so they could be several years down this road, we'll meet them where they are and help consolidate their efforts so that they can grow and then really just focus on the clinical aspect of their regenerative practice. But we also work with people who are just getting into this, into the regenerative space, who want to do this the right way. They hear a lot of the noise, they've been to conferences, and they want to do things the right way. So that's our goal, is that we work with great quality physicians across the country who really want to see this industry succeed.
Thank you, Brandon. I think that wraps up our questions.
Yeah, great. Please reach out. Again, thank you, everybody. We do this every Wednesday. Last week we did one on regulatory compliance. In the upcoming weeks, we've got reputation management that we'll be focusing on, and then also building out a cash pay business that helps you coming out of COVID-19. It's going to be very important to sort of regulate cash flow to the practice as you're opening your doors again. And we're entering this new normal. And so we've got some excellent speakers who are going to be speaking on those topics coming up. So every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, please join us for this webinar. And thank you very much for joining.